to record this event. Okay. So, good afternoon and welcome to our GroWInPro webinar entitled Envisioning Post-Pandemic Times, Economy and Society After the COVID-19. I am Duccio Zola from the Lunaria unit team. I am very glad to introduce this online event, which is organized in the framework of the project Public Engagement Initiatives. Today, we have brought together GroWInPro researchers and academics, together with the high-level practitioners and experts from the project stakeholders network. This allows us to meet one of the main GroWInPro goals, that is boosting dialogue between the academic and the civil society spheres. So following this cross-fertilization approach, in the next 2 hours, we will address some crucial issues about the pandemic, dwelling on the analysis and the assessment of its socio-economic and health impact, but also looking at the policy choices that should be made in order to trigger just and sustainable recovery. Our today webinar is divided into 2 sessions. The first one is designed to set the scene of the overall discussion, thanks to the contributions of 3 important speakers. Then, also drawing on these contributions, the second session will feature a policy roundtable, bringing together GroWInPro academics and representatives from the project Civil Society Organizations Network. The roundtable speakers will outline the pillars of a strong post-COVID recovery path, including the key policy reforms and policy measures that should be undertaken, especially at the European Union level. If anyone in the audience wishes to raise questions or comments, it is possible to use the Q&A section that you find at the bottom right of your screens. Then at the end of the roundtable, we will collect and deliver them to the interested speakers before concluding the webinar. I also remind that we are recording this event and we will make it available soon on our GroWInPro YouTube channel. Having said that, I would like to briefly introduce the key arguments that will be the focus of our today discussion. As you may know, GroWInPro has been dedicating in the last months much time, much energy to carry out an outstanding research effort on COVID-19 related issues. We have set up the devoted work package, that is work package 9, which is now filled with a vast amount of working papers, publications, and research findings based on fresh data and analysis. I would say that in very general terms, the overarching issue that stands out from our research effort regards the configuration of the relationship between the capitalistic market on the one hand and the state and public sector on the other hand, with their ability or their failure to cope with the dramatic consequences of the global health, economic and financial crisis caused by the pandemic. And also including their capacity to cope, to respond to the pressing social needs and demands brought about by the virus outbreak. This very general thematic framework, of course, contains a variety of research threads and topics, many of which will be on the table today. In this light, we will address the impact of the pandemic on in and between countries inequalities and on economic and productive sectors as well. Also framing the role played by nation state and by the European Union in terms of policies adopted. And another key discussion argument, as we will see, is the current regime of intellectual property rights on vaccines patents, associated to the trend of concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few conglomerations of corporate actors which have a privileged access and political standing in the current global governance architecture. I just stop here because I want to immediately leave the floor to Enrica Virgillito for the first contribution of the day, revolving around the presentation of the GroWInPro research activities and findings on the COVID-19. Just 2 words to introduce Enrica Virgillito, who is assistant professor in economics at the Institute of Economics of the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, research fellow at the Department of Economic Policy of the Catholic University in Milan, and also a Global Labour Organization fellow. Enrica is editor of the journal Industrial and Corporate Change, and she has also a prominent role as a Sant'Anna School researcher in the GroWInPro project, in particular for what concerns Work Package 9. So, Marica, thank you. The floor is yours, and you have up to 15 minutes for your speech.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everybody, and thank you Duccio and Lunaria for the organization of the workshop. I hope to, let's say, being able to present the main topics, result and perspective that the consortium has developed during the last 2 years. And I will try to, in a way, give you a glimpse of the content, but also of the main policy lesson that we can take out of our research. So first of all, let us try to understand the type of, let's say, responses that the GroWInPro as a consortium has provided, and second, yes, the policy lesson that have been written in many papers and that we will try to recompose in a unique policy brief at the end during, let's say, the final part of the project. So the activities that have been done by the consortium are organized in Work Package 9. That was a work package that has been created in order to address the socioeconomic effect of the pandemic, and has to be highlighted that the GroWInPro clearly was not meant at the beginning of his let's say, setting to address this specific content. So it was a research effort that was specifically introduced because of the arrival of the pandemic, and clearly it also reorganized the way and the structure in which the consortium developed some of the research activity. As Duccio said, we have now a new completely dedicated section of our website where all the results of, let's say, the analysis conducted since 2020 focused on the unfolding of the pandemic over the socioeconomic realms are collected. In terms of task and in terms of, let's say, research content, we have been organizing the work package in 2 different types of tasks. The first task was the organization of a high-level conference that we did in December 2020, and the second one is the task on which we are still currently working on, and is the development of, let's say, series of research activity, academic involvement to support policy decision and civil society engagement that will be finalized and wrap up in a report. What I want to outline and let's say to stress about the, in a sense, the feeling that the consortium had to address the pandemic is the multidisciplinary approach from the one end, and also the high involvement in policy advice that it will be clear in a few moments, but you will see that many of the participants of the consortium have been actively engaged in supporting policy advices. In terms of the organization of the web conference, many people that are part of this panel today have been also involved in this very first stage of, let's say, putting together the relevant pieces of not only of evidence, but also of issue, of question, of realms that have to be understood, was done in December 2020, and the main, let's say, topics that have been discussed were also those one that are actually at the core at this, of this work package. In particular, the teams, let's say, the teams that have been developed in the during those years are related to three main realms. One is related to the modeling of the pandemics, and modeling of the pandemics means trying to understand which are those type of mechanisms that drive interaction and drive diffusion from, let's say, the individual sphere to the population sphere. So there have been different type of approaches that the consortium developed. One is based on multi-scale type of models. The other is based on agent-based type of models. In both cases, we've been in contact with strong multidisciplinary teams, as I said, mathematician, virologist, immunologist, biologist, in order to have, let's say, a better and confronted but also appropriate way to tackle those issues that are all but trivial. The second main area of investigation has been related in terms of empirical effort to detect asymmetries with respect to sector of the economy in terms of input-output networks and global value chain. As you know, one of the most, let's say, relevant topic nowadays in terms of the productive side of the economy is related to global value chain disruption, and the consortium has been quite ready to address the asymmetries related to the different positioning of sector inside the economy in terms of vulnerability and in terms of exposure. The consortium has also looked at the dimension of occupation and workers in terms of access to, let's say, the possibility to telework, so of maintaining income and employment stability together with safety. And it has also looks at the different effect that firms have been, the different exposure of firms in terms of survival, but also in terms of strategy and responses that organizations developed in order to resist and to counteract the crisis. Finally, the last main big topic, if you want, that the consortium developed in a way or in another is asking about a new political economy or a new way to think the relationship between exactly capitalism and the role of actors as the state, but also of private actors, triggered or not by the pandemic. So the analysis focused on public sector capacity, which is the role of the welfare state, which is the type of provision that the states have to ensure or not, which is the role of policies in terms of, for example, industrial selected policies versus horizontal policies. The other topic is related to EU coordination policies, particularly in terms of fiscal rules. So what does it mean in the wake of the pandemic, talking about the stringency of the policy budget and, let's say, the be compliant with targets that are not anymore let's say, able to be appropriate to allow fiscal discipline? Do we still need fiscal discipline? These are other questions that have been, let's say, addressed inside the issue of coordination policies and clearly of the reconfiguration of the European Union inside a new completely environment. Socioeconomic inequalities, as I said, and the new divides due to teleworkability, which in some of our analysis have been considered a new strong, let's say, element of divergence across social classes. Now, in terms of policy-oriented activity, we've been developing both international and country-level policy brief. There are policy briefs that have been been written by the consortium for the UNID organization, in particularly addressing the role of science, technology, and innovation to foster the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis, and also another policy brief that has been written for the ILO in order to, let's say, to provide some policy lesson about medical intervention, and I will talk very briefly about that later on. In particular, to strengthen the need to relax intellectual property rights and to reduce the monopoly power of big pharma. There are also country-level policy briefs that have been developed by selected units, particularly Austria, Slovenia, Italy, and Germany. Clearly here I'm not covering all the outputs. All the output have been provided. I really urge people that are interested in going into the dedicated section of the website. I just want to now briefly address, just to setting the scene as I've been asked to do, some of the content that are relevant for the discussion later on and that also emerge out of our paper. So the way in which, let's say, the consortium GroWInPro has addressed the arrival of the pandemic, it has been a way to look at the arrival of the pandemic in terms of path dependency. So the idea is that there are preconditions that are there that have been on top of which the pandemic arrives, and it acts as an accelerator. In fact, we have been producing actually an infographic called the big amplifier. So the pandemic as a mechanism that put together pieces that were already in a bad path, in a bad shape, and it creates, in a way or in another, as we will see, propagation effect. So which are the pre-pandemic trends? You have been for sure, let's say, exposed to this notion of triple crisis in the economic, in the social, and in the environmental sphere. There is a very nice piece by our Mariana Mazzucato about this notion of the triple crisis that came out just at the very beginning of the pandemic. Crisis of the state is the other very important crisis that we have to address, and in particular of the role of the state as unable to provide, particularly at the very beginning of the pandemic, universal welfare protection schemes, but also the provision of protective devices. So the issue of shortages and the lack of supply was something that was not considered in advanced capitalist economy, and we've been facing, and we are still facing, supply scarcity. So this poses a question about the the way in which we consider sector of the economy as being strategic or not, and which is the role of the state in fostering or not strategic sector. Another crisis that I want to mention is the crisis of the regime of care that has been highlighted by Nancy Fraser already in 2016, and by all those scholars that trying to connect the crisis of the state together with the crisis of the meant as the inability of the welfare system to provide satisfaction from some basic needs, and in terms of also intersectionality with the female labor force, and also with those sectors of the economy and of the productive sphere which are more vulnerable. So this idea of the crisis of the regime of care I think it's very relevant to discuss because it put under the spotlight the necessity to reorganize a society toward the satisfaction of the true needs. And this is something that the pandemic has, has strongly required. Crisis of labor in general, in terms of essentiality of jobs and essentiality again of activity that are done by people. Do we do things that are necessary or not? And are we able to satisfy basic needs or not in terms of the organization of the productive sphere as a whole? Another important aspect that I want to highlight is another crisis that is very much under the spotlight nowadays, that is the innovation crisis in big pharma. So here I just mentioned some evidence about the notion of low innovativeness in new therapeutical treatments that have been put together by many scholars. You find the book by Angel 2005, but on US, but you have also evidence on EU, on Canada, and this evidence starts already since the 1980s. The configuration of big pharma as a sector in which R&D, especially in basic research, are lacking, and the establishment of a business model in this sector in which commercialization and marketing becomes the most, let's say, most important activity to ensure sales, vis-a-vis instead let's say the performance of true innovative activities. So acquisition and marketing instead of innovation. Crucial role of public financing for true discovery. Many scholars have been, let's say, emphasizing the importance of the public financing, NIH in this case, for the discovery of new medical, new therapeutical entities approved by the FDA. All these things, why I wanted to put all this list of, let's say, evidence. Here another piece that I think is interesting, apologize, an empirical evidence about the distribution of trade names in OB that are Orange Book patents. So those patents that are approved by the FDA, and these figures is just to tell you the fact that there is a very strong concentration of innovation activity of big pharma, even in those patents that are meant to address some actual disease in very few commercial, in very few molecules, in very few, let's say, trade name. So the idea is that you have a lot of concentration on very particular disease, and in the majority of cases, particularly the higher the difficulty to address those diseases, the less is the attention that big pharma has been devoting. And in fact, as a proof, you also find that the amount of so-called breakthrough patents, so those patents that come from big pharma that have a high level of citation are very tiny. And this is regards both those patents that are, let's say, in general pharmaceutical patent, and also those patents that are meant to address particular disease, those patents that you find inside the Orange Book, the Orange Book statement. So all those patents that are basically under the approval by the FDA. Why I'm saying all this, and I go back to the previous point, because I wanted to, let's say, provide an idea of the policy lesson that the consortium has tried to develop. In particular, I list policy lesson in terms of socioeconomic effects and in terms of medical therapeutical, let's say, effects in treatment. The pandemic-induced crisis, as I said, can be considered an accelerator of pre-pandemic trends in which we have asymmetries and inequality as the norm rather than the exception. There are many effects around the corner, and we have seen a lack of systematic support for the most vulnerable segment of the population, in particularly in terms of female employment and education at all level. There has been lack of support for temporary types of workers, and there are new profound divergences that are rising, in particular in terms of access to telework, to primary level education, and to digital infrastructure. In terms of medical responses, the reading of the consortium, or at least of part of the contribution of the consortium, clearly not all of them, is that many of the proliferation of different types of vaccine are not actually the, let's say, the result of proactivity of big pharma to the pandemic, but is rather the demonstration of the richness of the basic knowledge waiting for therapeutical exploitation. This is a very nice contribution by Giovanni Dosi in Intereconomics. There has been private appropriation of public research, and as I said, the innovation crisis in big pharma has to be let's say, put on the table. The public has been, let's say, in terms of reconfiguration of the political economy, we see a new public that is more, let's say, a taxpayer and a provider of money rather than able to address the rate and direction of innovative activities. And there is there is a urgent need of reconfiguration of intellectual property rights. So these are basically the message that I wanted to highlight. These are not the all messages, but those which I think are more relevant. And we have our infographic on the website, which I hope you can see. And yes, that's it, more or less.
Thank you, Maria Enrica, for your comprehensive picture of the vast amount of research activity and findings and policy messages carried out by the GroWInPro research activity on in Work Package 9. As we will see in a while, your contribution fits well with the arguments that will be the focus of the next talk by Nicoletta Dentico on the geopolitics of the virus. This is a term that echoes the English translation of the last book published by Nicoletta entitled Geopolitics of Health, COVID-19, the World Health Organization and the Pandemic Challenge. Nicoletta is indeed a writer, a researcher, and a civil society activist expert on global health and human rights. She has been former director of Doctors Without Borders Italy and co-founder of the Italian Observatory on Global Health, and also a consultant at the World Health Organization. And currently, Nicoletta leads the Global Health Program at the Society for International Development. Nicoletta, thank you for being with us today. I would like to leave you the floor for your 15 minutes speech.
Thank you, Duccio, and thank you, GroWInPro, for this invitation, which I value very much. But also, let me sort of congratulate on the amount of work and research that you have conducted, and which is, of course, a very important stimulus to produce knowledge and hopefully also to change the policy direction that not only Italy but Europe is actually taking in this very crucial domain surrounding health, especially after the pandemic. I see that you have created a webinar setting so that the first part is diagnostic, so to speak, and the second one is more on the prognosis side. But in my 15 minutes, I will, of course, make a diagnosis, also hinting at some of the policy ideas or policy alternatives that would have been should have usefully been set in place already in these 2 years that have gone by with COVID-19 already. Now, this webinar comes at an extremely appropriate time because this very week, is extremely momentous when it comes to the definition of the post-pandemic scenarios. Why? Well, because you may already know that on the 23rd and the 24th of February, The WTO General Council will meet again. We have not yet understood whether it is a formal meeting or an informal meeting, since after the cancellation of the ministerial conference in Geneva at the end of November, it seems that the only regime for negotiations is informal. So anyway, there will be a General Council meeting where, of course, once again, the thorny issue of the TRIPS waiver that was proposed by India and South Africa in October, on the 2nd of October 2020, will be relaunched and rediscussed again. In the meantime, they will also be discussing a lot whether the 12th ministerial meeting will be held sometime in this year. There's a proposal from the WTO Director General, Madame Dosi, to have this meeting in May. Then someone proposed June. Russia does not like June because they have their Davos session in St. Petersburg, exactly the same days that have been chosen. And now, of course, with the war, the rumors of war going on, everything is kind of standing still. At the WHO, precisely these very days, and on the 24th of February again, there will be the launching pad for the intergovernmental negotiating body for a new pandemic treaty that should be delivered by 2024 at the WHO. As you know, there has been a historic special session of the World Health Assembly at the end of November, beginning of December 2021, where the pandemic treaty idea was agreed consensually, and the intergovernmental negotiating body was mandated to actually facilitate the drafting of this new convention or whatever other instrument. There seems to be a lot of confusion under the sky, and even today, participating in the 7th meeting of the working group on pandemic preparedness and response, we have to notice lack of a clear sense of direction. There's really a lot of confusion. Moreover, you are aware that the WHO already has de facto a pandemic treaty in place. It's in the international health regulations that have been endorsed by 196 countries of the international community. And the one big question is why many countries are posing the question, why should we negotiate a new pandemic treaty while we should rather improve the one that we have used so far? And finally, still at the WHO, again, on the 24th and the 25th of February, there will be this important meeting of the Global Research and Innovation Forum. So I invite GroWINPro to have access to this meeting, because it is actually the R&D blueprint community around the WHO meeting again. Joseph Stiglitz will be the opening speaker at this very important session that is actually aimed at defining the R&D priorities for the future, and also see how the WHO can actually facilitate equity in terms of access to the COVID-related remedies. Now, this is exactly the same R&D blueprint community that on the 11th and 12th of February 2020, when the epidemic was still an epidemic. I mean, it was not yet recognized as a pandemic when COVID-19 was emerging in its gravity, but it was not yet a worldwide epidemic. The scientist community then, they recognized that in the face of the contagion and in the face of the kinetic of the virus, it was important to share all the knowledge that the community, the science community had, to cooperate out of a market logic, and that scientific cooperation and collaboration would be the only winning trigger to actually defeat SARS-CoV-2, okay? Of course, this message didn't sound very nice to some of those oligopolists that Maria Enrica has already referred to. and especially to some of the philanthropic actors whose wealth has developed and actually has been kindled by IP monopolies, who tried immediately to stop this sense of sharing and cooperation out of a market logic that the scientific community around the WHO had developed already then. So as you can see, much is happening around global health. It's one of the elements of my intervention. A lot is happening in the domain of global health, maybe too much even, too fragmented, certainly too quick. There is a sense of acceleration. I think Maria Enrica hinted at this earlier in her overview. There is a sense of acceleration of processes and initiatives that we are witnessing to, processes and initiatives that are not really grounded on the right evidence, that are not really carried out for perhaps the good public health interest reasons. And they are indeed not appearingly moving in the right sense of direction. I think we can say this after in the third year of the pandemic, because there is a sense that the dynamics of the pre-pandemic time are now being revised and re-accelerated due to this emergency drive that the health emergency is provoking. Of course, the feeling that we have is that as researchers and civil society activists, because I would not separate too much the academic community from the civil society. We have a lot of academic people that are, actively involved and studying and taking the floor with the civil society organizations. There are, what we can see is that this plethora of initiatives are really more driven by geopolitical interest and actually geopolitical assertions due to the pandemic, rather than by the serious assessments of the triple reality of the pandemic that is still affecting people very, very seriously in the world, meaning the health pandemic, the social pandemic, the environmental pandemic. And we will see also the financial pandemic coming on board, because as the IMF has declared at the beginning, in mid-2021, the projections is that 152 countries will actually be subjected to austerity rules by the end of 2022. This is, we're talking about 6 billion of people that after, their countries have increased their debt burden to face the emergency situation, will have to be confronted once again with the same austerity approach, financial austerity approach that produces other victims and produces other diseases. Now, so 3 years in the pandemic, I think we can say quite comfortably, quite candidly, that what we witness to is a bit of a Babel tower, where a lot of communicating initiatives are taking place, individual initiatives are taking place. So this Babel tower is not really a metaphor only, it's a reality of a collapsing multilateral scene. Of course, COVID has brought back the role of the state. It has actually illustrated very clearly that the primary responsibility of a state is to protect the lives and the security of its own people. This has really been, I think, the first pedagogy of the pandemic, and also it has brought to a renewed attention the relevance of the public health, the universal public health scheme as a main capacity that any state should have to confront itself with the reality of a pandemic tsunami like the one we have known very well in our country. But I would like also to say that what happened in our country shocked the world, because according to the WHO, Italy was supposed to have one of the best public health systems, universal public health systems in the world. So many countries, and we hear them say that, having said that in the international fora, were simply overwhelmed by the crisis in Italy. The pandemic has also revealed how the geopolitical blocs could use the production, the distribution of medical devices, and of course vaccines, to basically reconfigure the international arena, the international market landscape, and also gain enormous power. The COVAX international initiative is a case in point in this respect. Now, vaccine R&D, vaccine production and delivery has indeed reconfigured the contour of what used to be called the vaccine club, the byproduct of this market efficiency, which basically had 85% of the vaccine production in 2020 stay with 4 pharma companies, with Europe that was the world's largest producer of vaccine, followed by India, China, and the US. And now, after COVID, we have a completely different scenario. We now know that China is today the global producer, the leading producer of vaccine, followed by the US, and then by India and by the EU and India. So the situation has kind of changed. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic has also redesigned the international public health order. In a time of multi-stakeholderism, it has actually accelerated, it has propelled, it has enhanced this multi-stakeholder model, which creates so many problems in the new architecture of the global governance of health, but also in the overall global governance. As you know, the UN has signed a structure, not the UN actually, I mean the UN Secretary General, without any democratic request for endorsement by member states, but the UN Secretary General, who is now looking at our common agenda, signed in June 2019 a structural alliance with the World Economic Forum. And this is actually reshaping, talking about the relationship between the public and the private sector that Enrica was mentioning earlier at a global scale. This is actually redefining very much, and unfortunately, I don't have time to elaborate, the global governance in a post-pandemic era, where we see that the World Health Organization, which was very debilitated already financially and in terms of power play by the tension, the very abrasive tension between China and the US in 2020, has now, after 3 years of the pandemic, very much weakened by, one, the impossibility of member states to really come together and make decisions for the health emergency for over 2 years. And also it's basically gated, and I'm using this word on purpose. The WHO is totally gated in a operational architecture of managing the pandemic, hinging on public and private partnerships, or rather a new advanced iteration of public and private partnerships, because the ACT Accelerator, ACTA, and COVAX are the representation of a kind of a new model of PPPs, or what I would call a hyper PPP or a super PPP, that is actually now probably what the WHO member states are going to institutionalize for the future of pandemic and preparedness response through the pandemic treaty arena. And talking about patents, I know the time is really a tyrant, I'm aware of time, but talking about patents, or rather Let's talk about intellectual property rights. That is a wider notion than simply patents, and not only related to the vaccines, but all COVID-19 related remedies. What we are seeing in terms of the virus, the geopolitics of the virus, is that, as I said already, multilateralism is in serious jeopardy, since at the WTO, 3/4 of the member states of the organization have endorsed the idea of a TRIPS waiver, and a bare handful of countries are still blocking this proposal, which is a clause of already negotiated international law. And not even in the context of the pandemic, Western nations, which are at the origin of the TRIPS agreement in the WTO, are willing to liberate themselves, are willing to, to consider waiving this global IP monopoly feudalism that actually features the knowledge economy. Of course, people after me will elaborate on that. So what we see, and I'm coming to a close. What we see today is that after 1.5 years now of parliamentary resolutions, initiatives by international organizations, experts, the scientific community, almost 1,000 civil society organizations, the kind of channel of a liberal democracy, which is putting pressure, voting motions, endorsing resolutions that should bind governments, have completely jumped. I mean, this mechanism of democracy, the democracy line has gone off in many ways. So we are confronted with a deeper issue than the knowledge management. We are actually dealing with a problem of knowledge being the stumbling block of the democracy we shall have for the future. And when we're talking about IPRs, intellectual property rights, we are of course now all concentrating on pharmaceutical products, but we should be aware that this also applies to a lot of problems in the food domain, which is the other parallel pandemic, where recipes for the future in the post-pandemic times are talking about digitalized food, are talking about artificial intelligence to save the world from hunger, and similar solutions. So I'm finishing saying that meanwhile all of this is happening, South Africa, through reverse engineering, has almost concluded the reproduction of the Moderna vaccines. And South Africa is pretty much suspended because we are very aware and scared that Moderna might challenge this reverse engineering process that has enabled South Africa to produce its own mRNA vaccine. The president of the European Commission is under heavy storm for having had a really unusually friendly relationship on social media with the CEO of Pfizer, Alfred Bourla, but really total opacity vis-a-vis parliaments, vis-a-vis requests coming even from the European Parliament. And Europe is still refuting the African Union proposal to waiver the intellectual property rights and actually to allow the production of COVID-related remedies. If it had happened already in 2021, we would have had 8 billion vaccines more than we have today, as the Imperial College told us, and 57 countries already in the Global South ready to produce what the world needs to fight the contagion. So a very complicated arena, a very complicated scene, and I stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for your punctual and vibrant contribution that touched on the many harsh global problems regarding the political and health management of the pandemic crisis at the international level, the European Union level, and so on. And for recalling us how important it is to overcome short-term and selfish approaches and to establish the true international cooperation order based on not on profits and health for a few, let's say that, but on solidarity and health rights and health protection for all. I would add that all that you said holds true in most part, also with regard to the problem of the dramatic rise of inequalities as a consequence of the pandemic outbreak. And this is exactly the focus of the next contribution by Sarah Kaplan, who will tackle this issue from an intersectional gender perspective. Sarah Kaplan is director of the Institute for Gender and Economy at the Rotman School of Management of the University of Toronto, where she is distinguished professor of gender and economy and professor of strategic management. Sarah Kaplan is also a member of the GroWInPro advisory board and a renowned economist with a wide range of research interests and publication. The last book published by Sarah is entitled The 360 Degrees Corporation, From Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation, a book published by Stanford University Press, but also translated in many languages. So, Sarah, thank you. The floor is yours. I remind you our 15 minutes golden rule for your take. Thank you.
Thank you, Duccio, and thank you so much, everybody, for including me in this session. And it has been a delight to be involved with GroWInPro, although it'd be more of a delight if I could actually come to Italy during my involvement, but one day I will be able to get back. Giovanni has promised me for many years a meal, and I can't wait for that to actually happen. I am aware that the other presenters maybe were very liberal in their interpretation of 15 minutes, and I don't know, I know we're behind on schedule, so I want to know how you want me to manage my time here, Duccio.
Please try to be on time if you succeed.
Yeah, I guess we were going to end at 11:30. I only have 7 minutes. So let me share my screen, because what I want to do is, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Good. So what I want to do is call our attention to some of these socioeconomic inequalities that Maria Enrica talked about. She mentioned the question that has been raised by the pandemic around which sectors are strategic, and I want to argue that the care sector is a strategic sector that has not been paid enough attention to, even though so much light has been shed on that issue over the course of the pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about is what are the lessons for COVID, for the new world of work, and for our understanding of the unequal impacts. So it's important to note that there really has been an unequal impact of the pandemic when you take into all sorts of socioeconomic measures into account. And particularly if we look at gender, that a lot of the initial job loss was experienced more by women than by men. And I'm going to be using primarily Canadian data because that's the information that I'm drawing together, and you can make your own extensions into your own countries and sectors. And why was this? Because women tend to work in what we call the 5 C sectors of caring, cleaning, catering, clerical work, and cashiering. These were sectors that were the most impacted at the beginning, and by the way, are lower paid sectors on average than other sectors in the economy, which is a major explainer even prior to the pandemic of the gender wage gap, is this shuffling women off into lower paying sectors. And another reason, in addition to that women lost their jobs was because of lack of affordable or safe care services. The moment that schools and childcare centers close, that means someone has to stay home with the kids. And because of our gendered notions of whose responsibility that should be, that primarily fell on the shoulders of women, and in particular on racialized and migrant low-income workers. And I think we need to keep that in mind, in particular, as we go forward, and not just talk about gender, women and men, but also accounting for how that intersects with issues of race and immigrant status. So just to give you some notion of the nature of the impact of this on the economy, if we look at the nature of the recovery in employment, we can see just here, looking at mothers of children of different ages, you can see that while every mother experienced a loss of job, on average, there was a loss for every kind of mother in the first wave. You can see that mothers who are in couples, mothers who are in couples, their jobs have pretty much recovered. And where we see much less likely to have recovery is, of course, for single mothers who end up being lower on the socioeconomic status, especially single mothers with children younger than 6, because the childcare sector is the one that has been most disrupted. If we look at, for example, care work, we can see, sorry, it's so hard with this laptop to see everything that I want to see here. We can see the comparison here with the blue bars is April 2020 and the green bars is October 2020. We can see a major difference in who is taking care of children. And you can see that for the vast majority, it's only the women who are taking care of children. This has been an inequality that we thought in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this moment, a couple of months right at the beginning, in which in heterosexual couples where there was a man and a woman at home, that there was an uptick in the amount of care work that was being contributed by the men at home. However, unfortunately, that hope, we were all extremely hopeful for the first few months, but the moment that offices started to open back up, or the moment that people got more used to life, for example, for white collar workers, life on Zoom and working at Zoom, that share of help provided by the male partner basically fell back to pre-pandemic levels, but the need for care was still at an elevated level. So in fact, women have been contributing much more in terms of care responsibilities since the pandemic, while men have gone back to pre-pandemic levels. So this uneven recovery, I think, is another angle to take on it, is on care work. And this is not just for children, but also elder care, the problem of which has been really exacerbated in the context of this pandemic. And then if we look at another measure of outcomes, which might be stress, we can see here, again, comparing men and women with and without children, we can see that women are experiencing overall much more stress, and that increased very dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic. And that while stress levels have fallen for everyone, the gap between men and women has grown since the time of the pandemic. And so we see not only are women doing more care work, that not only are many women not able to recover their jobs, but their level of stress is higher than it was pre-pandemic, and the gap with men has widened. And I should note that even though women's employment has, in some ways, for most women, has recovered, the real question is, what is the quality of the employment? And early evidence is suggesting that while women are, and this is true for women under age 55, above 55, women's employment has also not recovered at all. And we believe that that's because many women above age 55 are playing caregiver roles, either for their grandchildren or for their elderly parents. And so we're seeing, and then for the women whose jobs have recovered, a lot of those jobs are lower quality. They've either gone to part-time, they have gotten off the promotion track, they've taken some other kind of role within inside the organization that gives them more flexibility. But we're seeing as some job recovery, but not in quantity, but not necessarily in quality. Okay. This is also true for entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship has always been held up as this great panacea of something that could solve women's economic inclusion, but we see that women entrepreneurs have been more likely to be in the affected sectors that were closed down and more likely to have to assume more care work at home. And many of the recovery programs we talked about in the previous two talks, the importance of the state, many of those recovery programs were not tailored to the particular features of women's entrepreneurship because their businesses were likely to be smaller with fewer employees, maybe not incorporated, maybe self-financed. So what we're seeing is that even in the space of entrepreneurship, women's entrepreneurship has been disproportionately harmed by the impacts, the economic impacts of COVID. Okay. what brought us to this point? Well, of course, everyone has been saying it took a pandemic for the country to see what was already broken. Arundhati Roy talks about the pandemic as a portal that has allowed us to see the fractures in our society that maybe we had not seen before. And it's a system that has consistently disadvantaged women, low wage, migrant, racialized, and other marginalized communities. And we have just seen that much more front and center. Those people in positions of power have seen that. Of course, people in those communities have known that all along. And we have seen that the essential workers are really being treated as expendable. People working in meat processing plants, people in care jobs, people who are cashiers at grocery stores or doing delivery of groceries and food. We call them essential workers and we applaud them, but we treat them as expendable because we don't give them the same kinds of protections. Certainly in the Canadian context, for example, many care workers, many immigrant workers do not have access to paid sick leave, and that is leading them to work sick, infect others, and create more of a crisis. And while I know the racial and dynamics are very different in the Canadian context than, say, in the Italian context, where in Canada, we have particular attention to the legacies of slavery and the legacies of the genocide of the Indigenous peoples in the Canadian context. We have also a large immigrant population. And of course, the immigrant population in Italy and other countries in Europe has been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Okay, let me also say that there have been important ripple effects when we take into account the economic impact. So dramatic rise in domestic violence. We call this the shadow pandemic, with people stuck at home. This is creating additional pressures. Dramatic rise in mental health stressors, as I mentioned. And many communities continue to face immigrants, insecure housing, barriers to access to the internet. We say we want kids to go back to school, but we're going to do it online. If you don't have access to high-speed internet, that can be problematic. And in the Canadian context, we have many communities in the Canadian North who have even lack of access to clean water. What we launched at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, we partnered with the YWCA Canada to launch the first national plan globally, first national feminist economic recovery plan. And the state of Hawaii has done one. Now, subsequently, other countries have done them, but we were the first to focus on what recovery would look like if we took an intersectional gender-based lens to what the pandemic impacts have been. And we focused on, first of all, the intersectional analysis, addressing root causes of systemic racism and sexism, focusing in particular attention on the care economy and the care sector as one that includes paid and unpaid work, where the paid work is underpaid and the unpaid work is undervalued. Investing in good jobs for everyone, that means the kind of benefits we're talking about, like paid sick leave and things like that, fighting the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, bolstering small businesses who employ most people in an economy. We tend to think of, recovery for large companies, but in fact, small employers are the predominant employers in the Canadian context. Small and medium-sized enterprises employ 91% of employees working in the private sector. Strengthening the infrastructure for recovery, and that means the care infrastructure, along with things like the internet infrastructure, and making sure that diverse voices are included in the decision making as we go forward. So I will conclude just with a few thoughts on implications that I think for the GroWInPro community, for the kinds of conversations that we've just been having. The first is that traditional measures of economic well-being do not capture some of the most important issues that have arisen out of the pandemic, and we need to include them if we're really going to understand the nature of prosperity in our society. That means GDP does not capture the caring economy, mental health, decent work, access to housing, and things like that, that are crucially important. And we need to create other measures and to validate and value those measures as much as, or maybe even more importantly than we do GDP. When we think as scholars about what is our dependent variable, what is the outcome measure that we're trying to understand, if we always put GDP or economic growth as traditionally measured, we are not going to be understanding the true impacts of policies that we've been already analyzing in this conversation. And, you know, fundamentally, policymakers, and if you take that kind of caring economy view, the gender-based view, it really highlights how much policymakers are still stuck in a 20th century industrial economic mindset, which privileges the financial over social and fails to understand kind of the really important aspect of care as it contributes to the economy in all of its forms. And so I really wanted to, you know, my ongoing interventions for GroWInPro have always been around those issues. They've been extremely important to me, and ones that I think need to be foregrounded as GroWInPro moves forward in thinking about policy recommendations, whether it's on the global health side, as we heard from Nicoletta, on all these questions about which sectors matter, as we heard from Maria and Enrica. I think these are really important issues. I will post a few links in the chat for people who are interested in some of those resources. And I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sarah, also for having been in time. You provided us with an insightful take, and you have clarified, I would say, once and for all, how uneven are the burdens of the pandemic crisis, and how women and most racialized and marginalized communities are actually paying an exorbitant and absolutely unfair cost on their shoulders, with all that this implies in terms of radically, and I would add urgently, rethinking our economic and welfare schemes in our nowadays societies. Now, thanks to the contributions by Sarah, by Maria Enrica, and by Nicoletta, we have accomplished our mission for what concerns session 1 of the webinar. We have collected a lot of food for thought. We are ready to start with the next session that for sure will reflect on all that. Thus, I leave immediately the floor to our GroWInPro principal investigator, Andrea Roventini from Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, who will be the chair of the final roundtable entitled Policies for Post-Pandemic Times. So, Andrea, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and let me thank all the people that are participating to this workshop. And Sarah, will be very happy to have you with us in Pisa as visiting when you want to come, and for sure. And I think that it was we had a lot of food for thought, from gender inequality to pharmaceutical or vaccine apartheid, and all the research that was performed during GroWInPro research, and as have very well highlighted by Maria Enrica Virgillito. So now the idea is to have a sort of roundtable with great experts, both academic experts and from the civil society, to discuss the policy for this post-pandemic era. And I think what I would like to have is to have a sort of two round of intervention by each speaker. So I think that the first round could be something more diagnostic, and possibly maybe the second round we discuss much more about policy. Of course, up to you, and each round by 5 to 10 minutes. So who are our guests? Well, we have Massimo Florio, who is professor at the University of Milan and is a member of the Forum on Inequality and Diversity. We have Marica Frangakis, who is in the steering committee member of the EuroMemo group. We have Giulio Marcon, spokesman of Sbilanciamoci coalition. And last but not least, we have Giovanni Dosi, who is the deputy director of the GroWInPro project. So I would say that Giovanni go last, and maybe we can start with Massimo Florio. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. I was really impressed by the extension and depth of activities of this project. So I will stick to what our chair Andrea suggested us to start with the diagnostic part of the situation. And clearly, one has to decide which part of the diagnostic to consider. I will focus exclusively on what we have been learning from the pandemic in relation to the functioning of the pharmaceutical industry and the market. This was the topic of a recent study that we have completed at the request of the Science and Technology Panel of the European Parliament, and the link is now in the chat if you wish to give a look to it. That study was based on extensive critical consideration of the existing literature, plus over 60 interviews with international experts under an anonymous format. This is also because there were also on board of this exercise some top managers in the industry, and we tested this hypothesis with them. We asked this question: what would you think if Europe in the future has a public research infrastructure for drugs and for vaccines and for biomedical innovations, based on a supranational effort with an innovative mechanism for patents and for intellectual property rights, particularly in areas neglected or not well covered by the industry. And to the surprise of many, to a certain extent, including to my surprise, the consensus was overwhelming about having such a public infrastructure. Why this? I think there are two reasons, and this is related to the issue of the diagnosis. Because first of all, there is if you prefer, a regional consideration, Europe vis-a-vis the United States. In the case of the United States, it was very clear that having them, the National Institutes of Health, with its budget, which is now $41 billion per year, which just to give a comparative size, it is 40 times the CERN, or it is 7 times the European Space Agency. So having the National Institutes of Health on one side, and having BARDA, the Biological Research and Development Agency, on the other side, allowed the Trump administration to be extremely quick in involving the pharmaceutical industry in preparing the vaccines. So while it is true that Europe could say that after all, BioNTech is in Germany, and that for AstraZeneca, the vaccine was developed in Oxford, it is also true that the clear winners are Pfizer and Moderna in the international arena. So purely in terms of competition between the capitalist systems in Europe and US, Europe suddenly discovered that its only position was to negotiate with Pfizer and Moderna and signing checks, one after the other, with this scandal that was mentioned earlier about we don't know how many WhatsApp messages between Ursula von der Leyen and Mr. Burla. So signing checks, dealing in a very non-transparent way with the top of the oligopoly in the system. So this is, in terms of diagnostic, probably is an alarm bell even for some conservative quarters in Europe. By conservative, I mean just interested in the geostrategical position of Europe in the business of the biomedical industry. But second, there is another issue, again in terms of diagnostic, and it is that when you look in depth in the history of the vaccines, where the boundaries of the intellectual property do lie, is extremely confusing. Why? This is because the patents filed by Moderna, by Pfizer, by BioNTech, and so on, either cite some non-patent literature developed by public institutions such as the National Institutes of Health or others, or in some cases, and very recently in the case of Moderna, omit to mention the role of public scientists at the NIH. This has created a potential for legal issues of a size and importance unprecedented. So even in a very narrow legal perspective, it is now clear with the history of the vaccines that this ring fencing of where the knowledge about the vaccines lies is in fact is dangerous, is confusing. I conclude with the example of Moderna and South Africa. Moderna, from the very beginning, because they got over 1 billion support for their research by the Warp Speed operation by the Trump administration, they announced rather vaguely that they wouldn't have sued in the courts imitators of their vaccine. But now that an imitator is there, Afrigen in South Africa, with the support of the WHO, they do not respond to questions raised by Nature journalists who simply wanted to ask them, is it true that you are not going to sue in the courts Afrigen because they have reverse engineered their vaccine, and the management of Moderna didn't answer the question. So if you look at in this perspective to the next 30 years, it is clearly a nightmare what potentially could happen, not just the story of the COVID vaccine, but all the story of innovation in medicine is questioned by what is going to happen. I will stop here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Massimo. And now I will give the floor to Marica from Frangakis, which I think is going to talk also about the EuroMemo report, right?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I'm going to be very quick, really, because the time is very tight. So I'm going to give you some headlines, and we can go in more deeply if there is more time at the end. So basically, in this first round, I shall refer to economic developments, and B, policy response. With regard to economic developments, there has been recovery. There is a recovery going on in which started last year, but one has to bear in mind that in the year before last, in 2020, there was a plunge of the economy, the European economy, I'm talking about the EU at the EU level, by nearly 6%. So what we're seeing, what we witnessed in 2021 could be characterized as a bounce back effect. So this makes it a weak recovery. At the same time, there are very great divergences amongst across the member states. For example, Germany, the powerhouse of the EU, recorded 2.8, and whereas Ireland recorded nearly 14%, when the average for the EU was about 5%. So you can see there's a great variation across the EU. At the same time, I call this a weak and fragile recovery because there are also quite a number of factors which make for uncertainty. And well, the first such factor is the pandemic itself, the COVID and its variations and its mutations and so on. At the same time, we have multiple risks ahead: supply disruptions, rising energy prices, overextended financial sector, climate shocks, trade tensions, and the COVID pandemic, which I already mentioned. One more significant development in the past year was the increase in inflation. Now, there are fears of a wage price spiral taking on, and I believe these fears are overstated. Basically, what we have is transitory factors. It is uncertain which factors will remain and which factors will disappear as and assuming the pandemic recedes. At the same time, we have to bear in mind that the labor market is nowhere close to overheating. Employment in last year was under the level of 2 years ago, the pre-pandemic level. Unemployment, it has gone back to the pre-pandemic level, but we need to bear in mind the huge divergence across the EU member states. For example, when the average of the EU was about 7% last year, it was 13% in Greece and in Spain. And at the same time, you have the young, the under 25s at 15%, which is more than double the rate on average. And again, going back to Greece and Spain, 30% of the young under 25s are out of work. Similarly, wage rates have been dropping. Last year, there was an increase of less than 0.5%. So what I'm saying is that the wage price spiral, which is being talked about by financial analysts and commentators, is to my mind, a way to pressurize the ECB to raise rates, interest rates. There is, at this time in speaking, in talking, there is no, it's not at all clear that such a spiral is taking on. In the area of economic developments, also, we should note that after the activation of the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, the fiscal deficit and the public debt went beyond the limits of the SGP, and again with great variation across great divergences across the EU member states. So that was very, very quickly the main elements that I wanted to raise in the in relation to developments. Now, what was the policy response? The policy response was on two levels, at two levels, at the national level and at the EU level. At the national level, I already mentioned the activation of the general escape clause, and that meant that the member states basically bore the burden of dealing with the pandemic. They, in 2021, the fiscal response of the EU member states is estimated at approximately 19% of GDP for the period covering this year as well. Also, member states provided guarantees and tax deferrals, and these sort of liquidity support, one would call it, it's another 20% of GDP. Now, at the EU level, I'm sure you've all heard of the Next Generation EU plan, which took nearly a year to be decided upon, and it was put into effect last February in 2021. This is, for the standards, by the standards of the EU, quite large, but again, it is by the standards of the EU, which is not exactly very generous. So it amounts to about 5% of EU GDP for the period 2021 to 2026, which is about 1% per year. It is of temporary duration, and in the sense that legal commitments must be made by December 2023 and related payments by 2026. At the heart of this is the Resilience and Recovery Facility, which it corresponds to 90% of the plan. And interestingly, this is split in between loans and grants to be given to the member states. Nearly half and half, 53.5 is loans and 46.5 is grants, consists of grants. It is to be funded through the issuance of bonds by the European Commission on behalf of the EU. Basically, what I would like to argue in this case is that although what we have is an interesting development, which is limited in time, it's limited in size, and I should also add, subject to the conditionalities of the economic semester plans, which the member states have to submit, and within which the recovery plans are contained. I argue that we have an important departure from the institutional dogmas, if you like, that we know of in the case of the EU. And these departures are two. One is providing grants, a kind of transfer payment to member states, and two, borrowing on the capital market. These are important departures, and I believe the progressive left, the left should take advantage. It opens up space for debate on issues that we, at least at the EuroMemo group, we have been arguing for a long time. Also, of course, it has exposed the TINA doctrine, there is no alternative, for what it is, which is a neoliberal construct, which has very dire consequences for the greatest part of the population. Turning to monetary policy, that was, it continued being accommodative throughout 2021, and it hasn't changed up until now. There is a kind of divergence here between what is the ECB is doing and what the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and other banks, central banks, are doing. Pressure is being applied on the ECB to start raising interest rates on the basis of the inflation, specter of inflation, I should say. And as I said earlier, I do not support the view that we're being confronted by a wage price spiral. I believe this is overstated, and any attempt to either raise interest rates or to start on fiscal, as the chair of the IMF warned very recently, member states should start focusing on their fiscal sustainability. So any attempt to actually press down in these two areas, fiscal sustainability, so-called, in other words, start taking austerity measures, or raising interest rates, will cut short a recovery which is still weak and fragile. Basically, these are the points I would like to raise. There's a longer piece which Duccio has received, and which is at the disposal of the members of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Marica, and I will move to Giulio Marcon, the spokesman of Sbilanciamoci, for his point of view more on the diagnostic side, and then we come back on the policy side. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Sbilanciamoci Coalition is a network of 49 civil society organizations dealing with public budget, public policies, and so I think that everybody knows. We know that the pandemic has overwhelmed not only the health systems but the economy of the world. Between March and June 2020, the collapse of the stock markets has been dramatic. Consumption has collapsed, and the production system has largely stopped, putting employment at risk. We know that without public intervention, the social consequences of the crisis would be devastating. So the last Oxfam report on inequality, 2022, shows that it gives us some important information. The wealth of the super rich has increased a lot over the period of pandemic. Billionaires worldwide increased from 2,095 to 2,660, and during the pandemic, a new billionaire appeared in the world every 26 hours. The aggregate net wealth of billionaires increased by more than 5,000 billions in real terms. The wealth of the world's top 10 billionaires has increased since 2020 by 540 billions. An asset, usually the preserve of the rich, are luxury cars, and this is also an interesting indicator. In 2021, the sale of Rolls-Royce in the world increased by 49%, and that of Bentley by 31%. So the growth of the wealth of the rich is due on the one hand to the growth of certain sectors that have benefit from the pandemic, big pharma, digital, and so on, in which the rich have invested, but above all to the incredible expansion of the financial markets. If we compare December 2021 and April 2020, the Dow Jones has increased by 53%, and the Italian stock market by 59%. While the rich have become very rich throughout the financial markets, the workers have remained stagnant, and the payroll of the poor has grown larger. Investment in financial assets has mainly concerned the rich and super rich, while the poor people, while the lower and middle income classes have saved their savings mainly by keeping them in their current accounts or in low yield government bonds. The growth of finance no longer has any relation to the real economy and has been sustained by, above all, by the monetary expansion policies promoted by the central banks. After the onset of the crisis, a lot of liquidity was offered to the financial system, keeping interest rates close to zero. On the one hand, this has allowed the low-cost refinancing of the public debt of all countries, but on the other hand, it has offered financial operators, banks, large companies, and the richest investors the possibility of betting on the rise of the value of stock market shares. So the result is the emergence of a speculative logic that has inflated stock market prices and the value of the financial wealth of the super rich. But this is a speculative bubble that is bound to deflate or burst violently as soon as the orientation of a monetary policy changed. The United States Federal Reserve has already sent the first signals to this effect. And now something is changing because also of the risk of inflation and because of the energy troubles. So with the pandemic, not only did the rich become even richer, but the number of poor people has also grew in very important way. According to the WHO, some 120 million people were added to those already living below the extreme poverty line, while according to Oxfam, the increase in the number of poor people at the end of the pandemic could grow to 500 million. In a year and a half, those living below the absolute poverty line have increased by 97 million, while those living on $5 a day have grown by 163 million. So during a period of global recession that of the 2002 pandemic of radical slowdown or closure of many productive activities, economic and social suffering has increased in very strong way. With the exponential increase of poor and unemployed people, but wealth has incredible increase. And not only in the sectors we told before, big pharma, digital, logistics, but privileged have not been affected by the crisis, and financial real estate assets have not been affected. And indeed, after the first months of the pandemic, values have returned to grow as early as 2020. So to conclude, in spite of many government measures aimed at supporting the most exposed social groups with monetary transfer and other social and financial support measures, in pandemic, the global wealth grew by 1%, but the wealth held by the richest people, 0.001% of the world population, around 51,000 people, grew by 14%. So the wealth of the richest people in the world in 2020 is more than 3 times that of the 2.5 billion poorest people on the planet. So this is a situation that we observed during the last months. And if you take into account the 0.01% billions and many multi-millionaires for a total of 520,000 people, their wealth in 2020 reached the percentage of 11% of the share of world wealth. So to summarize, the pandemic has increased inequality, exponentially increased the enrichment of the people, of the privileged people, and increased the expansion of financial markets thanks to the measures of the central banks of quantitative easing. On contrary, instead of correcting the policies of the last 20, 30 years, these measures of the first 2 years of the pandemic have, increased the wrong dynamics of an unsustainable economic and financial system. So it's true that it's true that with the pandemic, public intervention by government has regained a role, and austerity policies have been suspended, and it's a good thing. But what we see that this good news coexist with very no good news, bad news, because there is again a trend in the direction of a privatization of public services, the regulation of financial markets, the devaluation of labor, and the increasing reduction of the principle of progressivity of tax policies. And we will talk about this in the second round. When the pandemic crisis will be overcome, the return of the policies of budgetary austerity. So there is no mention also of a European minimum wage, the harmonization of tax policies, a common industrial policy for all the fight against inequality. So these are not exactly good news, probably for the rich people it is. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Now, Giovanni, I leave you the floor. If you can tell us more what we have learned and what is very relevant on the diagnostic side from the GroWInPro project, and then we pass to the policy side.
Well, I'm helped a lot by the fact that the people preceding me have said basically everything. So let me just summarize. I mean, there is one big question in the background. Is the pandemic a break on previous trend, or is it an acceleration? There are some of our friends, also some Schumpeterian friends, that go around and say every crisis is an opportunity, blah, blah, blah. I think this is bullshit. As most of the people that preceded me start to indeed Marica, we have two Maricas, Marica Virgillito in this case. In fact, it accelerates the response to the policy response to the pandemic, accelerated the previous terrible trends. Let me telegraphically call them. The exploding divergence between real wages and productivity, with the lowest part of the real wages that remain stagnant. I mean, I'm rough in the sense that then trends are different and the intensity are different, but among European countries and between Europe and the United States. But this is a broader stylized fact. Second, you have an increase in the share of profit in GDP and in the enormous increase of financial profits, with an associated explosion, we've just heard it, in the inequality in wealth distribution. We have an acceleration, a long-term acceleration of the rentification of the economy. Indeed, in this part, the acceleration is particularly high due to information-related rents, the Amazon of this world, and drug-related IPR that have exploded during the epidemic. The only thing that slowed down is globalization, and not as a choice, but simply because you had a disruption of international value chains. I mean, it was not voluntary. And another thing that is important, is fundamental, is that even under the crisis and even under an increased intervention by the state in the economy, the boundaries between the activities governed by markets and those not governed by markets did not change significantly. I mean, even when the government intervenes on the pharmaceutical sectors, especially in Europe, it wants to be extremely market friendly. I mean, I sign checks and do whatever you want, which is, I think, disgusting. Note that these are not the outcome of the pandemic per se, are the outcome of the policy answer to the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is not the Black Plague. You had a massive, in most countries, a massive policy answer that was deeply asymmetric across social group, classes, gender. So, I mean, if you want to rank, you have informal workers, immigrants, women, essential but expandable workers, as Sarah was putting it, they had no or minimum protection. Formal workers and the small businesses had some protection, depending on the various countries. Big firms had most of the protection. Finance, banks, and real estate had 100% protection plus. And this was not, I mean, it was not given by God, given by the pandemic. This was the outcome of the policy choices. One could say, well, there was a break in austerity, yes. A break that is temporary. Is temporary, and now we have the talk of going back. I mean, if you read the discussion of after World War I, it is very similar, saying, well, we needed to give some protection to the workers because otherwise they would have been on strike, etc., during the war. But don't think that this protection will continue when the war is over. We had some vague health care, but don't think that we will going to reproduce it afterwards. Basically, we are having the sliding toward the same. Well, there is a lot of talk, but a lot of talk of changing. This sounds to me like the Italian understand it as a Napolitan expression, fare a muina, that is moving a lot around without accomplishing anything. And it seems to me that in the policy discussion, there is a lot of fare a muina. In particular, and this we come back next in the next round. In particular, what worries me is that there's not been a construction of any alternative consensus, and in fact, the lack of an alternative, say, progressive alternative, at least in Europe, has remained there, or even got worse in countries like Italy, that we have this unanimous coalition around Holy Saint Mario Draghi. So, well, I'll go back to the policy conclusion later on, but my assessment is essentially a very negative assessment, a very negative diagnostic of the effect of the policies associated with the pandemic.
Thanks a lot, Giovanni. So we'll go to the second round, and then we'll ask about Massimo, Florio, Marica, Frangakis, Giulio, Marcon, and Giovanni about policy for the post-pandemic times. We are a little bit out of time, so if you can stay around 5 minutes maximum, will be great. Massimo.
Okay, thank you. So what should be done? I'm not saying what is actually politically feasible, but what should be done. One idea that draws from previous discussions and proposals, particularly at the Forum Diseguaglianze e Diversità, is to create a public infrastructure for research and development on pharma, turning to a paradigm which is no more about subsidies to the industry, but in terms of public investment. Let me explain the idea, going back to what we say to our students about ways to counteract monopoly power. So because I still teach public economics to undergraduate students, usually what I tell them is that a traditional response to monopoly power in the textbook is taxing profits, because taxing monopoly profits is more or less equivalent to lump sum taxation, because you cannot change the equilibrium between marginal cost and marginal revenues just because you have taxation. Unfortunately, this textbook recipe is not very helpful when the tax base is no more in your jurisdiction, and it moves away in such a way that they actually get some kind of shopping of the best tax regime they want. I mentioned this is for the big pharma and not particularly for the very small startups. The second mechanism is antitrust policy or regulatory policies. And again, this is an inflated balloon. I mean, there is a lot of regulation around pharma, and in the end, we get an industry where, according to the General Accounting Office of the United States, the rate of return is twice the top of the list of companies in the stock markets worldwide. So it is an entire collapse of the second receipt. Then there was the third alternative, but that alternative was forgotten in recent textbook, and the alternative is public enterprise. So we wouldn't have in countries as Italy, even in the liberal economic thinking tradition, a public firm, a public enterprise in electricity against the oligopoly of electricity, without this understanding that in some cases you need structural solutions. You cannot think that governments and legislators can deal just with rules. You need structures. So our experience in certain industries which were captured by oligopoly was that public firms, public enterprises could have been a solution. Is this feasible in the pharmaceutical industry? My answer is yes. We know that we can go in terms of research and development along all the chain until the product is there, ready for authorization by the regulators, by the European Medicine Agency or the Food and Drug Administration. Let me tell you what the Oxford University people told me about AstraZeneca. They told me that because they were working with this viral vector since more than 10 years, in fact, they didn't need to have AstraZeneca as a partner. If the UK government would have supported them until the end, they could have acquired in the market the services of a contract development manufacturing organizations, which, by the way, are the hidden part of the industry, because we do not know that those firms are in fact the key suppliers of not just manufacturing, but also of the multi-clinical trials. So you can think of a public infrastructure going all along the line in the development of some pharma or vaccines. And in the end, it is not necessary to have the factories to produce them, because you can go through procurement mechanism. So it is entirely different going through subsidies or advance payments to the big pharma, or having your own property in the public interest of innovation and utilize a network of suppliers to do the job for you, for the public sector. Let me conclude with this. This is not purely fantastic. It is real. For instance, we have in Europe the European Space Agency that works in that way. They have a mission, they have a structure, and case by case, they pick up their suppliers, either private firms or private-public partnership, and so on. And they have in their hands the process. So if around the world we have a network of 28 satellites for Earth observation, this is not a market mechanism. It is having a space agency doing that job. Why should we do this for satellites and not for farming? It is feasible, I think. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Massimo. And Marica, Frangakis, what about policies?
Thank you, Andrea. I shall carry on as I started in the first part, which is to concentrate on macro stuff, macroeconomic developments and policies. That does not mean that one would have nothing to say on inequality, on the speculative bubble, and so on and so forth. Clearly, I would agree. I agree with the previous speakers. However, I have concentrated on a particular area. Carrying on from where I stopped, when it comes to policies for post-pandemic times, I have a first part which relates to what I call the need for paradigm shift. And I should link this to the fact that the Stability and Growth Pact is under review right now. It was, the exercise was started in February 2020. It was frozen because of the pandemic, and it was relaunched in October 2021. What the Commission wants to do is to simplify the rules, to make them more comprehensible and transparent, and to facilitate communication and enhance national ownership and better enforcement. That's what the Commission is saying it wants to do in the relevant documents. Now, basically the Commission's initiative seeks, to my mind, to marginally improve the existing model, which has been proven to be not only irrelevant, but also harmful. Paul de Graaff has argued very recently that the Stability and Growth Pact has no scientific basis, it is unintelligent, it has zero credibility, it is constantly changing, and it is becoming ever more complex. So such a system of governance is collapsing under its own weight. Instead, What is necessary is a total shift in paradigm. What that means is that we need to the policymakers need to recognize the fact that social, economic, and ecological issues are intrinsically related and that market-based solutions do more harm than good. Such a paradigm should include both economic and socio-ecological perspectives on an equal footing, instead of the current dominance of economic considerations over all other spheres. In fact, previous speakers, and if I remember correctly, Sarah Kaplan mentioned something to this effect already. Furthermore, I would like to add that a paradigm shift should also include an alternative framework for fiscal and monetary policies, whereby fiscal policy is the primary tool of macroeconomic management, targeting particular groups, regions, and sectors, with monetary policy playing a supportive role. Fiscal and monetary policy considerations need to be integrated into a single framework as opposed to the institutionally established separation of the two in the EU at present. Overall, a holistic approach is needed, the value of which has been made abundantly clear by the COVID crisis and its repercussions across all spheres. And such an approach has to be based on the revitalization of the economic role of the state, allowing the pursuit of economic and socio-ecological goals. Now, I shall give a few more certain broad directions in which the EU economic governance paradigm could move or should move. First, integrating the social in the economic. The European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan, which was endorsed by the Porto Declaration on the 7th of May 2021, should be integrated into the architecture of the economic governance of the EU. This should be based on full employment with high quality jobs and just transition to a socially and environmentally sustainable economy, while non-GDP indicators should be employed to measure the well-being of societies. Again, this was mentioned earlier by the speakers in the first part of this discussion, and I'm happy about that. The specific socioeconomic and environmental challenges faced by different member states must be taken into account. The one-size-fits-all notion should be abandoned. We've already seen how all the developments have presented huge divergences across the EU member states. Now, fiscal and monetary policy should coordinate so that money and credit are re-embedded in public policy pursuits. This is especially the case given the present climate and health challenges and the need for greatly increased public investment. Thus, a coordinated system of credit allocation and budget financing is necessary, encompassing the issuance of bonds by the European Commission on behalf of the EU. This is a big development, and we should not underestimate it. As it has been pointed out, the reconstruction effort of many post-war advanced economies was based on such a model of governance. Daniela Gabor made this point. Reinstating public services. After years of budgetary restrictions, public services have been weakened and shrunk in size. The pandemic brought to the fore the significance of a well-functioning and effective public services sector. In particular, the health and education sectors were largely privatized in the 1990s and thereafter. The extreme burden caused by the pandemic was shouldered mainly by doctors, nurses, and teachers, who struggled to maintain a modicum of service to patients and students. The lessons of the pandemic need to be learned, and the role of public services to be enhanced in the economy, linking it to the needs of society. The new governance architecture must be made fairer and more sustainable. The EU's difficulties in achieving a common approach to taxation remain a critical obstacle to building a strong foundation. After all, taxation is of great importance in the context of democratic legitimation of macro policy. While the EU has accepted the OECD's recommendation of a 15% minimum rate for corporation tax, it has done nothing to counteract the widespread practices of tax avoidance and money laundering. The sovereign debt accumulated as a response to the COVID-19 crisis must be dealt with at the European level. Some of the largest Eurozone economies, such as Italy, Spain, and France, are experiencing especially large debt increases, as are countries in which entered the crisis with an already high rate of public debt, such as Greece. In all cases, the risk of a bond market panic cannot be discarded. To head off such a risk, the ECB needs to buy government bonds in primary markets. It's doing that in secondary markets right now. In this way, the threat of a bondholder panic is averted, while there is no permanent legacy of unsustainable levels of government debt. At the same time, private debt resolution requires special attention. In addition to sovereign debt, the debt accumulated during the pandemic by private individuals and businesses needs to be resolved so as to avoid incurring financial risks and to ensure an equitable recovery. Overall, the entire policy formulation and implementation process of the EU needs to be democratized. In particular, the European Parliament should participate in the decision-making process regarding the setting of macro objectives and policies, overseeing their implementation, and making the European Commission and the ECB accountable for the results achieved. The role of social actors and social partners also needs to be taken into account in the new paradigm. Now, the above proposals outline the main features of an alternative paradigm. It is an indicative rather than an exhaustive list. Strong oppositions to such demands may be expected from the vested interests in the current system. Hence, it is imperative that public discourse is encouraged and broadened to include alternative ideas and proposals, and that social actors, including trade unions, social movements, and initiatives such as the EuroMemo group, mobilize in this respect. Finally, the COVID crisis has been described as a crisis within a crisis, given the ongoing impact of climate change on countries and their economies. In this sense, it presents an opportunity, not just to build better, but to build differently, to past policies and practices. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. We have then Giulio Marcon and then Giovanni Dosi.
Thank you. So in 5 minutes, I will try to just to give the titles of the proposals, and I concentrate my proposals on the issue of inequality, or to reduce inequality, and on the issue on the redistribution of wealth. So something already told Marica. Marica made some proposal that I want to again to underline again, and so I try to give you 5 proposals, just the title, to try to gain the aims of redistribution of wealth. So the first proposal, of course, is regarding Europe and the problem of the harmonization of a EU policy, EU fiscal policy. It is a very big problem. We have to avoid competition among the states, but this is one of the crucial issues of the next years. It's very difficult to reach this result, but it's a very crucial issue to build a real common fiscal policy in Europe to avoid what happened in those years, in the last years, with all the competition among the states on fiscal issues. The second topic is regards this stronger regulation on fiscal havens. Something has been done in the last years, but something more have to be done in the next years, and we have to fight very strongly against the fiscal havens and all the not regular system of allocation of resources in this fiscal havens. The third point is what the has been done also in the last year, a minimum global tax on corporations, and we know that there is this this proposal decision of 15% tax, 15% on corporation is very quick measure, and it's also the implementation of this measure is not very simple. And so we are waiting for the implementation and of the results of this minimum proposals regarding the corporation. We have to work to increase I mean, to improve this measure, also to implement this measure. The fourth point is what I mean the World Inequality Network proposed also in the last report. Global tax on wealth. It's very difficult to realize, to implement. It's very difficult to to foresee how to implement this kind of a proposal. But so we have to discuss how to tax, how to have some concrete measures on the taxation on wealth in the world. And the proposal of the World Inequality Network is very important because can open a debate on this topic. And the last one is what was called the Tobin tax. I think you can call in different way, you can name in different way. The problem of the high frequency trading is always a very big problem. Something started at European level many years ago. There was this kind of enforced cooperation between 12 states, 12 countries, but not very concrete results. We saw in the last 5-6 years. So you have to launch again this kind of proposal, also to stop this kind of high frequency trading, and also to stop the deregulation of financial markets. That is one of the problems that we today we have to face and we have to overcome. So I will stop here, and this is, the 5 proposals that I think we have to propose and to discuss in the next months.
Thanks a lot. All these proposals are very relevant. Not only the one from Sbilanciamoci, but from the previous speaker for the GroWInPro project. Giovanni, you have the last talk, and then I'm sorry we don't have time for questions because it took too much time for discussing and for presenting the result. Please, Giovanni.
But again, I'll be very telegraphic because many things have been said before. Let me divide the policies under various titles. First one, and nearer the pandemic issue, our health policy. There are things that are absolutely easy. Increase the overall expenditure for the health system, for the public health system, strengthening local hospital, have a territorially distributed hospital system, strengthen the role of GPs, general practice, family doctors. And if we want to save money, and we should, reduce the public subsidies to private clinic. If we do that, we will be prepared for the next pandemic that will arrive, and will be able to, other things being equal, not to have the horrors of the lockdown. Of course, this time we said we did not have time to prepare. Well, let's start now and have recuperate a universal, distributed, good and effective public health system, or build it up in countries where it's not there yet, like the States. But I think Marica, the other Marica, was saying we need a paradigm shift. Yes, this is another case in which we need a paradigm shift in which we have got to stop thinking healthcare as a good, but we have got to think of it as a universal right. And if it is a universal right, it's not negotiable. It's like the right to justice or to free speech. Is a non-negotiable entity. It's not a good. Well, then we've got research, innovation policies, and I think I simply need to repeat what Massimo was saying. I mean, we need to go, and I quote verbatim, from subsidies to public investment, all the way from basic research to the production of the things that we really want. Then, I mean, we leave to them cosmetics. Yes, okay, they want to produce cosmetics, and there are people that want to buy it. Fair enough. But the things that we need, we have got to produce them. With all the rest that comes with it. On intellectual property right. Intellectual property rights are dysfunctional not only for developing countries, but even for developed countries. The overall rate of innovation, Marica Virgillito was discussing it before, has fallen. And less the private industry is doing fundamental research. Less and less in generating new chemical entities. Was absolutely absent from vaccines. Of course, if you pour billions and billions, obviously they jump in. But think of the one that is coming, of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. There, nobody cares. The public does a little research, not very much. Private industry does not do anything because it's costly, time-consuming, and for a time being, concern more the Indians than the Europeans, so we don't care. When it's going to come here massively, then it will be too late. Let's think about it. And again, and I quote again Massimo, we need to go from rules and subsidies to structure and institutions. I'm really tired of this discussion. If there is a market failure, but you have got to see if there is a bigger government failure. I mean, this second-rate American economist discussion are really boring and misleading. Third, redistribution. We have abundantly talked about rent, especially financial rents. We need to tax them. We need to tax them in different ways. Income, you've got to switch back taxation from wages to profits and from profit to rents. And you can do in complementary ways. I mean, wealth tax are welcome, and in fact, they are more feasible than what people generally claim. For example, even in Italy, there are of financial wealth. Estimates suggest that we have 5 trillion. Our friend Modiano estimated that, a conservative estimate. If you tax a little bit, not much, say all those chunks of wealth, financial wealth above 500,000, already you've got a significant taxation. A part of taxes on transaction, digital, but also Tobin taxes. Marcon was saying it before. All these, I mean, I'm a bit wary of saying Europe should do it. Because there are things that we can do it, even without Europe. And if there is to break some rule, European rule, we use the middle finger if we want to do it. For example, Tobin taxes and digital taxes can be easily done in one country. I'm not claiming that you can have socialism in one country, but at least digital taxes, yes, because the Italian will continue to access internet, use Google, buy Amazon on internet, and so you can tax them. And if you tax the transaction, even marginally, you make a lot of money. Then labor market and institution. We need to extend workers' rights, including migrant, informal workers, with a special attention to gender. Working hours have to be reduced. I mean, I think that it is unimaginable to think of decent full employment without a reduction in working hours, with consequences on international trade that is not time to discuss here. We don't have time. And this, I mean, this consequence on international trade, yes, this one have got to be handled at the European level, cannot be handled by individual countries. We need to rebalance labor power, increase real wages, introduce universal income protection, and in general reinforce the bargaining institutions of, let me say it, the working classes. I mean, the working classes has changed face, but they're still there. I mean, I don't know what one wants to call the people coming to deliver the pizza. We never use them, but there are a lot of people that do. They are workers. To every effect, they're workers. And they need protection, partly by organization and partly by law. My final point on all this is that you need actors. And the space example that Massimo was suggesting is interesting also to highlight the differences, because the space is a win-win. And you can have public institutions non-economically motivated because it is the prestige, it is the discovery, which also benefit those that produce magnets, that produce engines, telescopes, etc. So it's a win-win on both sides. On health and farm is different, because you've got very powerful interest on the private side, and so you need strong actors on the other side. I mean, if we think, and even some friend of ours think that there are good pharma company and bad pharma company, we are out of the way. I mean, you have got at most different degrees of badness, but there are very, very subtle differences in the black. To paraphrase the American right wing saying, a good pharma company is a dead company, is a nationalized one. You don't have good private pharma. I think that, of course, we cannot write this in the final report to the union, but in the undertone, I think we should keep the idea that our analysis might be beautiful, but if we don't link with actors that fight, not only try to convince, but fight knowing that there are contrasting interests in society. And we have a model, a paradigm, as Marica Frangakis was saying, that is very, very different. And I think that if we have a success in our project is to marginally back an alternative view, an alternative project of society. Sorry, I ended like a little pope, but this is it.
Thanks a lot, Giovanni. I think also the policy brief you're about to write on EPR and vaccine and the pharmaceutical sector will be a way to convey our message to European Union in a gentle way, I would say. So I would close here. I apologize for being a little bit late. And I thank everybody that listened to this workshop and to all our speakers and to all our guests. I think there were a lot of fruitful interaction and a lot of fruitful thought also for the GroWInPro researcher and for the people that were here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. 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 Thank you.
Ciao, grazie.